It began not with chaos, but with stillness. In a valley hidden among the Tian Shan Mountains of Central Asia, where icy winds brushed the ancient trade routes of the Silk Road. There, sometime in the 1330s, a quiet transformation began. No one in Europe even knew this place existed. Yet beneath the soil of a small settlement called Karajagash, history was already changing. Stone markers began to multiply in its graveyard, each carved with the same single word: pestilence. Out of fewer than 500 graves from that time, over 100 came from just 2 years, 1338 and 1339. For centuries, the story stopped there. Then, 700 years later, scientists reopened those tombs and found a microscopic clue inside the teeth of the buried. It was the genetic signature of a pathogen, the ancient ancestor of what would later sweep across Europe. This was the starting point of an invisible journey that would reshape civilization itself. The organism had lived quietly among rodents and the fleas that fed on them, a balance of nature that, once disturbed, became unstoppable. When the balance shifted, the infection learned to travel, first through animals, then through humans, moving silently from host to host, city to city. The Mongol Empire's enormous trade network, the same system that once connected half the known world, became the perfect highway. Caravans crossed deserts, ships traced river routes, merchants traded grain, fur, and silk. Unseen, the contagion traveled with them. Every exchange, every handshake, every port stop was a new bridge in its expanding web. Even as the Mongol realms fractured, the roads stayed open, and the thing that had begun in an isolated mountain valley now flowed westward, following the pulse of trade and migration. By 1345, it reached the shores of the Black Sea, where Europe waited, unaware of what was coming. From that moment, history would be divided forever, the world before the pestilence and the world after it. By the mid-1340s, the great trade arteries of Eurasia pulsed with life. Caravans rolled through the deserts, ships left crowded harbors, and merchants believed they were carrying prosperity across continents. But among their goods, silk, spices, and grain, traveled something unseen. The first known leap into Europe began at the Crimean port of Kaffa, a Genoese outpost on the Black Sea. In 1346, it was besieged by the armies of the Golden Horde. Within the walls, sickness spread rapidly. Outside, the attackers fell just as fast. Some chroniclers later claimed that the besieging forces hurled contaminated remains over the city walls. Whether or not that story is true, Kaffa became the perfect doorway through which the contagion entered Europe. When the Genoese finally fled, their galleys carried more than cargo. As they sailed west toward the Mediterranean, unseen passengers clung to their ships, fleas within grain stores, rodents below deck, and perhaps human travelers already ill. Each port they touched became another spark in the growing fire. In October 1347, a fleet reached Messina in Sicily. Witnesses wrote that sailors arrived barely able to stand, and that within days entire households fell sick. The local authorities tried to drive the ships away, but it was already too late. From Sicily, the infection spread like a tide through Italy's trading centers: Genoa, Venice, Florence. By the start of 1348, it had crossed the Alps, moved along the Rhone, and reached the heart of France. No place was spared for long. The same routes that had once made Europe rich now carried its undoing. Merchants followed the flow of opportunity. The contagion followed them. From Marseille to Paris, from London to Lubeck, the pattern repeated: ships docking, markets opening, and communities falling silent within weeks. People began to notice strange coincidences. The disease followed the ports, it followed the roads, it followed them. By the summer of 1348, the first ships reached England's southern coast. Within months, the sickness spread northward through London, striking rich and poor alike. Contemporary witnesses described a sense of confusion and disbelief. No one could understand how entire cities could darken so quickly. Every connection, every handshake, every shared cup had become a risk. By 1350, the wave had reached the edges of the known world: Scotland, Scandinavia, the Baltic states. From the mountains of Norway to the deserts of North Africa, the map of Europe was being redrawn, not by kings, but by contagion. The age of global connection had turned against itself. The same networks that had built prosperity now carried the price of it. Trade had conquered distance, and in doing so, it had carried ruin to every shore. When the plague arrived, it didn't announce itself with thunder or fire. It came quietly. A ship docking at a port, a merchant coughing in a crowded square, a rat slipping through a grain sack. Then within weeks, entire towns fell silent. Streets that once echoed with laughter turned into corridors of fear. At first, people searched for answers in the heavens. Priests led endless processions, carrying crosses through empty streets, begging for mercy. Others believed it was punishment for sin, that the world itself had been judged. In panic, some turned to extreme faith, whipping themselves in public to atone for humanity's guilt. Others rejected faith entirely, turning to pleasure and chaos, saying, "If death comes for all, let us die smiling." The social fabric of Europe began to tear. Families abandoned the sick, neighbors barred their doors, trade routes collapsed, crops rotted in the fields. Gold lost its meaning when no one was left to spend it. The great cities, Florence, Paris, London, became hollow shells of what they once were. Bells tolled endlessly until even the sound of mourning grew numb. Monks and physicians struggled to explain the inexplicable. Some blamed bad air rising from swamps. Others suspected the stars had turned against man. None could stop what was coming. Letters from survivors described villages where not a single soul remained alive. In some places, dogs and wind were the only witnesses left. And yet, amid all this horror, life tried to go on. Markets reopened for a few days. Children played in courtyards too young to understand the silence around them. And somewhere, a baker still lit his oven at dawn. But the rhythm of life had changed. A deep fear had settled into the bones of Europe. The knowledge that everything familiar could vanish overnight. The world, once certain of its divine order, had cracked. And through that crack seeped a new kind of awareness, that humanity was fragile, mortal, and frighteningly alone. When the plague finally loosened its grip, Europe did not celebrate. It exhaled. What remained was a civilization haunted by absence. Entire villages stood empty, swallowed by weeds. Fields once alive with voices now whispered in the wind. Survivors wandered through abandoned homes, unsure whether to mourn or to thank the heavens for their own survival. Yet from this desolation, something unexpected began to take shape. The old world, its hierarchies, certainties, and faith in divine order, had been shaken to its core. The church, once the unshakable pillar of truth, had failed to protect its flock. Prayers had not stopped the dying. Holy relics had lost their power. For the first time in centuries, people began to look not to heaven for answers, but to themselves. This quiet revolution didn't happen overnight. It began with questions whispered in taverns and monasteries, then written in the margins of books. Scholars, desperate to understand what had gone wrong, turned back to the wisdom of the ancients. The works of Aristotle, Galen, and Cicero, forgotten for generations, resurfaced. A hunger for knowledge spread, driven by the realization that faith alone could not explain the world's cruelty. The collapse of the population reshaped society. Labor became scarce, and suddenly, for the first time, common workers could demand better pay. Serfs walked away from the fields that had bound their ancestors for centuries. Lords who once ruled through fear found themselves begging for hands to harvest their land. The rigid pyramid of medieval power began to tilt. Cities that survived grew restless and bold. Florence, Milan, and Venice rebuilt not with superstition, but with ambition. Artisans, architects, and thinkers emerged from the ashes, determined to make sense of life's fragility through creation. Out of grief came beauty, frescoes depicting both despair and hope, sculptures of human strength and divine suffering. Medicine, too, began to evolve. The Black Death had exposed how little humanity understood about its own body. Early doctors started recording observations instead of repeating dogma. Slowly, the idea took root that knowledge could be discovered, not simply received. And beneath it all, a new awareness pulsed through Europe, that death was not only an end, but a mirror. It reflected everything false about the world before: blind faith, unchecked power, complacent wealth, and forced people to rebuild from truth. What rose from the ruins was not the same Europe. It was humbler, more curious, and infinitely more human. The plague had destroyed millions, but in doing so, it cleared the ground for rebirth, the first quiet steps toward what would become the Renaissance. From the ashes of despair, a new world slowly rose. Europe, scarred and shaken, began to rediscover itself, not as a realm of kings and priests, but as a continent of minds. The silence left by the plague became a space where thought could echo again. The world had stared into the abyss, and in doing so, had learned something profound: that human life was fragile, but human curiosity was indestructible. In the cities that endured, Florence, Venice, Milan, survivors built not only walls, but ideas. Wealth that once flowed into cathedrals began to fund workshops and studios. Art returned, but it no longer served only God. It began to serve humanity. Painters captured emotion in every face. Sculptors sought perfection in the body, and writers dared to describe the world as it truly was. Out of death came a vision of life so powerful that it would reshape civilization. The Renaissance was not born in comfort, it was born in grief. The plague had stripped away illusion and left only truth. When half of all people vanished, what remained was the will to make meaning of what was left. Knowledge became sacred again, but this time, it was human knowledge. The rediscovery of anatomy, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy wasn't just intellectual revival. It was an act of defiance. It said, "We will not die in ignorance again." And so Europe awakened. In Florence, Brunelleschi raised domes that defied heaven. In Milan, Leonardo dissected both bodies and ideas, searching for the mechanics of creation itself. In Venice, merchants carried not just goods, but culture, spreading the spark of rebirth across the continent. The Black Death had tried to erase humanity, but instead it forced humanity to evolve. Faith became deeper, art more human, science more daring. The world that emerged was aware of its mortality, yet more alive than ever before. Centuries later, every painting, every book, every scientific breakthrough still carries the echo of that darkness. The plague was a wound, but also a beginning. It tore the old world apart so that a new one could breathe. And in that, perhaps, lies its most haunting legacy, that sometimes the end of the world is only the start of understanding it.